Welcome back. I'm joined by Mark Milke, who is the president and founder of the Aristotle Foundation. We're discussing their latest project, the 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished and Not Cancelled. Very fascinating book, probably controversial given today's lens, but let's continue discussion. So before commercial, I asked you such a loaded question. Is Canada a racist country? I ask this because, especially in the last few years, race tensions seem to become very inflamed to our neighbors south of the border. And whether we like it or not, things spill over from the United States into Canada. And we are very different countries and we have very different histories. So I think it's important that we look at ourselves on our own history and not judge ourselves by what has happened in America. How do things like critical race theory play into how we view our past and how we view Canadian history?
Well, massively. There is the simplistic theory today, and it comes from Ibram X. Kendi, the American academic, who says basically, if you look at groups statistically and there's difference in outcomes, incomes, for example, the differences must be due to racism. He's monocausal. It's a simplistic theory, and it's kind of circular. If you see differences, the cause is racism, and the outcome, by the way, is racism. So what we try and do in the 1867 Project, and Matthew Loud does a wonderful job of this in his book on incomes and racism in the book. Matthew Loud is a bit of a Thomas Sowell analysis, if you've heard of that American economist who's done this for 50 or 60 years, looked at race and incomes. Matthew takes apart the Stats Can data here in the Canadian context. And what you find is, first of all, let me back up. First of all, he defines what racism, systemic racism is. Systemic racism is not that there's an occasional bigot out there, which you and I might meet, or someone might meet. That's probably always going to be the case, unfortunately. Systemic racism is when, for example, a neighborhood in Victoria before the 1960s wouldn't allow those of Chinese ancestry to live in their neighborhood. That was systemic racism. San Francisco hospitals run by whites that wouldn't allow Chinese people in 100 years ago. That's systemic racism. We're telling blacks in Ontario they could not live in certain apartments or rent certain hotels before the 1950s. What Matthew does, though, is then define systemic racism as it should be. Institutional systemic racism, that is what it is, not a bad glance or a bad word. So, and then he takes apart the incomes. East Asian Canadians are at the top. People with your skin color and my skin color are kind of in the middle. Some Indigenous Canadians, the average is lower than the average for everyone else, but there's a reason for that. More Indigenous Canadians live in rural areas. Their populations are younger. They might live on reserves. They do live on reserves, obviously, some. And that contributes to lower incomes because the economic opportunities are not there. So what Matthew Lau tries to do is say, look, be careful about throwing the word racism around. It's very loaded. And Canada in 2023 is not Alabama in 1923.
And I know you had a contributor, Jamil Javani. He wrote a piece for your project as well about his experience as a Canadian of color, I guess, and how he experienced almost the reverse opposite in his world of media.
Well, Jamil, who is black, says, look, don't expect black Canadians to have monocausal, views on anything, or, that all of us somehow have to have the same view, be liberal or be conservative, whatever. Jamil leans to the right side of the spectrum, you could say. And so he takes apart again this reverse racism and what he calls recycled racism, where, the federal government now will give you a grant depending on your skin color. He calls that recycled racism. And Jamil is absolutely right. So it's a wonderful chapter in the 1867 Project where, again, he calls, like the rest of us do, to treat people as individuals, not be seen as some part of a collective. None of us can change our ancestry. I mean, this is what Martin Luther King tried to do for decades and others. And, to point out that character matters, that the individual matters. And somehow through, I think in some cases, the best of intentions, but wrongly thought out theories like from Ibram Kendi, that somehow if you see differences between groups when you measure statistics, that somehow it must be due to racism. Well, that's like Thomas Sowell once observed, when you see the Swiss not involved in the fishing industry around the world, but the Italians dominate it, does that mean the Swiss have been discriminated against? No, there's another explanation. What is it? The Italians grew up around shorelines. No kidding, they would dominate the fishing industry, unlike the landlocked Swiss. So again, we live in a simplistic age where people like to throw around accusations, but they often don't think through them.
Right. And, I'm a child of immigrants to Canada. and my father escaped communism. We've seen this divide and conquer play before in my family's history. Uh, but it was interesting in your book, and we're going to tease this, we're going to pick it up in just a few moments after a commercial, that you actually had some immigrants contribute to their experience in Canada. And they, in fact, found it was the reverse, that they had experienced racism back home in their country, but then when they came to Canada, they had opportunities they would never have had. We're going to ask that question in just a few moments.